Hi, this is Curt and welcome to another edition of Fire Law Roundup. Hi, everyone. This is Curt and welcome to another edition of Fire Law Vlog. Today, I've got a couple of guests, and before we get to the guests, I just want to orient folks to what I originally started out doing with regard to the podcasts and then the vlogs. My dream was to be able to interview people who were involved in litigation. And what I really had hoped that I'd be able to do is create sort of almost like an archive of these interviews that people could use. I know a lot of folks use the material here in their fire science classes, the fire law component of their classes, and also leadership classes. But kind of felt like I would read about a situation like the Coconut Grove fire or the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire and say, boy, would I like to talk to someone who was involved in those incidents? And in each of those, there was a substantial amount of litigation in those incidents. And as a result, no one really was able to document that. And the reality is, once the lawyers get involved, many times people don't want to talk. So that leads us now to our session here, where we have litigation, but we have folks that are willing to talk, and I really appreciate it. And Diane Hendry and Deborah Kochan are here with us. Diane was or still is technically, right, a division chief with the Fremont, California Fire Department. And Diane, go ahead, tell us what happened and what led to your adventures in our justice system.
Sure. And Curt, just thank you for doing this. Before I get started, I've followed you for years and have read what you've put out about cases and have always done it, like you said, from an educational standpoint and to understand the issues and things that are going on in the fire service. And so one of the things for me coming out of this was talking about it and being able to talk about it, and that's a choice that you make because, it can have an upside and a downside to being willing to share your story. And for me, one of the key issues the whole way through the last 5 years from when all this started and to now the case being settled was just no information, just a vacuum of silence to where people really didn't understand what happened, why I ended up having to use the litigation route to stand up for myself. And so I knew on this side of it, I did want to be able to share my story and talk about it so that one, we could educate, and two, people can understand, and three, we can keep moving the fire service forward in hopes of, getting a handle on these things before an employee or a situation gets to the point where you find yourself in the legal arena. So
that's my goal. That's my goal as well.
Mm-hmm. So really, so it was 2016. Well, I was promoted to division chief in 2014. And so I was a line captain prior to that, and then took the division chief's test, and that was going to be a 40-hour position in the office. And there was 3 of us promoted at the time. There was one for operations, one for training and EMS, and then one for administration. And the fire chief selected me for the administrative spot. And I reported directly to the fire chief. The other 2 reported to a deputy chief. And I really had the HR function for the fire department. So I had discipline, I had FOBAR, investigations, where I worked collaboratively with the human resources department. I had workers' comp, where I worked with the risk manager for the city. I had recruitment, hiring, promotional exams, where I worked with another person in human resources, where we did that together. So I was really this liaison to all the other departments in the city, operating under the direction of the fire chief. And so in 2000, we had been doing some recruitment and hiring, and it became a goal of the city manager to actively recruit and hiring more women. When I got hired in 1993, so 30 plus years ago, there was 5 of us. There was 5 women out of about 150, 160 sworn employees. And there was 5 of us for a long time. And then the other 4 retired after long, successful careers. And then in 2013, we hired our first woman that we'd hired since then. So in 23, 24 plus years, we hired our first woman. And so by the time I was promoted to division chief, there was just 2. There was myself and the other that was newly hired in the field. And so the city, this was noticed, and the city wanted to actively make this a priority in our recruitment because we were hiring quite a bit. We were in that transition of retiring out a lot of people and hiring a lot. So we had already hired about 50 new firefighters and only this one woman. And so since I had recruitment and hiring, that got tasked to me that we were going to actively do a wide search, a lot of outreach, and come up with strategies to try to be able to recruit more women into the Fremont Fire Department. And so we were doing that. And it was the first where it was, I started to notice some tension around that topic with the department and the line personnel. And so we got into this recruitment in 2016 with that as a goal. We ended up hiring 17 people. We hired 1 woman, and she was the sole woman in the academy. So we got through the recruitment. I passed it off to the training division because my part in it was done at that point. And we had an entry-level academy that was about 16 weeks, 4 months. And she ultimately, the training division recommended terminating her towards the end of the academy. And so the fire chief had brought her in to let her go and gave her the reasons for letting her go, that she didn't pass these 4 tests. And she articulated that that's actually not true. I did pass these 4 tests, and there's probably some other things that you should know. And she went ahead and described one of the captain's treatment of her, and that he had harassed and discriminated against her. And so then at that point, then it came back to me because I had investigations for the department, and the fire chief asked me to look into it. Because this academy was going to be the most diverse that we'd had in a long time. It was diverse with not just gender with this 1 woman, but also with people from different backgrounds. And so the training division decided that they wanted to be able to video the performance standards in the academy. So they went out and bought the eval system, so that they could video the recruits as they were performing the standards and have a record of it. Yeah. And so one of the first things I did was get access to the video program, so that the chief asked me to look into these 4 tests that were in question. And so I did, and what I found was that she did pass these 4 standards. And when I looked at other recruits who were on the lower end of performance and was able to compare, it was that she not only passed, but she was above some of these also. And so I was able to gather this information and put it together. I shared it with the chief, and he agreed. And so that led to the chief recommending a full investigation into the academy and the termination of this woman. So ultimately, we went through that whole process. She got her job back. She's wildly successful. She's been about 5 years now. She's promoted to engineer. She's on our U-Star team for our area of California. She's goes all over and helps with swiftwater rescue, and she is she's worked on her master instructor. She teaches at the academy. She's done an amazing job. And so for me, from that point forward, then it all felt to me to where I was, somehow I had done something that, got her job back, or whether I, and of course, along the way, there were other people who were looked at through this investigation. So we had the captain who was treating her poorly and discriminating and harassing her. He resigned instead of going through the investigation. The deputy chief of training resigned after the investigation prior to receiving any findings. And both were of tenure where they retired, they resigned and retired and went on to other things. And then the training division chief that was left, he was the only one technically disciplined. He got a letter of reprimand for his actions and his involvement in what happened to this woman in the academy.
That sounds like the way it should have went. Now, why did you end up in court?
Well, so then the fire chief at the time that was here for all of this, he retired after a full career. And then we went to the outside and hired the fire chief of San Jose, which is a city in the South Bay near Fremont, a larger city than Fremont. And San Jose Fire is in a different retirement system. So a lot of their high-ranking chief officers go on, they retire from San Jose, and then they go on and work in a PERS system, which is the retirement system of most public agencies in California. And so so he retired from San Jose, and he applied for Fremont and got the chief's job in Fremont. So he came in on the heels of all of this. So this person had gotten her job back. The other people had resigned, retired, and the fire chief had retired. And so he came in on the heels of this, where we'd gotten through a lot of the heavy lifting and the hard part of what had happened. And then it would have and should have been he who then led us through the next phase of addressing what happened, teaching, educating, and moving the department forward. And so for me, instead of that happening, it was all of a sudden I was iced out, and I didn't have many of my job duties left. He told me I couldn't talk to human resources anymore. I was left out of meetings. I was excluded from high-level conversations and things that I normally would have been included in. And it became clear that I was the person that was being held as the lightning rod for all of this.
And the missing link here in terms of this story is that the deputy chief at the time, when all this happened, was appointed to acting position while they were in the process of looking for a new chief. And although Diane had a very good relationship with this person throughout her career, as it happens, he had to reprimand his best friend, who was one of the folks who was implicated in this. He was what was his position? And you can pick it up from here.
He was the division chief of training that received the letter of reprimand. So he and the acting chief at the time, they were hired together, went through the academy together, godfathers of children, like very close friends. Yeah. And so Deb's right. There was two parts to that. One, that he had to reprimand his friend and hold him accountable, and ultimately then created a new position for him outside of the training division. And then also he had, this deputy chief had aspirations to be chief, but one of the qualifications was that you needed to have at least a bachelor's degree. And so the city manager was clear about that from the beginning, and the fire chief, I mean, this was not an unknown, that if you were going to seek the position of fire chief in Fremont, you needed to have your degree. And so he did not have it. And so he was able to fill the acting role, but wasn't able to apply to be the chief. And so there was a lot of, I think, feelings around that in that area. And then ultimately had a feeling of that by my doing this and exposing all of it and continuing to try to work on the things that we needed to do as a department to improve, like standards and what we ask recruits to do, you know, hose pulls, ladder throws, that we shouldn't be making things up on the fly, or, you know, making up a new hose pull in the middle of an academy because we think that we're gonna, you know, be able to wash somebody out that maybe we don't want to be there. That I had stayed on track with all of these things, and that I think he felt like I was hurting his chance to be chief.
Yeah, and so the new chief came in after this deputy chief had been acting for a number of months, and I think the hostility had certainly more than begun. It had picked up some pretty major steam by the time he came on.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. And so then what happened?
So then so it was good. This was probably a good year where, you know, I'm really a glass half full, and, you know, you don't get that, like for myself, you can't get this far in the fire service as a woman or somebody who's different without having pretty thick skin or being resilient and being able to bounce back from things. And so, you know, I have that about myself where every day I can come in and move forward if everybody wants to move forward. But it just kept closing in around me. The union was very involved with the new chief, and the union president at the time, you know, he was upset that all of this had gotten exposed and that these other union members had, you know, resigned or retired. And then there was, I think, a fair amount of worry amongst the rank and file about, you know, somehow Diane has too much power. Like, how did she, you know, how did all of this happen? And, you know, that we were able to successfully bring this woman back and move forward from this. And so I think that the new chief was getting a lot of input and pressure from, you know, different camps, whether it was the union, it was the, you know, the deputy chief who was the acting chief, and never talked to me. And so I tried multiple times to connect and, you know, hope that he would read into what had happened, and that, you know, we were going to move forward and be successful from here. And it just didn't happen. It just kept getting, I was on ice, and I kept getting more and more iced. And then there was a couple conversations with people who wanted me to step aside. Like I said, I was being left out of things. And then one of the catalysts was, when we were bringing this woman back, the acting chief at the time, we had captains meetings. We had quarterly captains meetings where the chief officers, the battalion chiefs, we would meet with each shift with the captains and talk about current issues. And so there was one schedule to talk about bringing this person back and why, and what we could talk about the investigation. And I was excluded. So all of the division chiefs, including the one who got disciplined, was included in these meetings, but me. And so at that point, it became clear that, oh, I'm on an island. And so I filed an internal complaint with HR. It was quite a while before I went, you know, filing a lawsuit, because being in the fire service, I know what that means.
You're right.
Right? Like, I mean, my career is over.
Well, let me just, because I know you've been talking for a lot, so I'll give you a chance to kind of collect your thoughts a little bit. But in my experience, I have many women reach out to me, and the last thing they want to do is file a lawsuit, because they know when you get to that point, it's almost like the point of no return. And no matter how resilient you are and how much flexibility you have, it becomes you've crossed the line. And I get the sense that maybe many of the folks felt like you would cross the line when those officers were disciplined. And I don't know how you do an investigation. It's something I struggle with too. How do you do an investigation and do justice to what happened and not cross that line when it comes to possibly disciplining firefighters? It's Sophie's choice. It's like impossible. But at any rate, go ahead. So now we're up to the point where you're just about ready to file a lawsuit. I'm sorry, Deborah. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say you're absolutely right in that as her case unfolded, all the evidence pointed to the turning point that you just referenced, is her being involved. And they didn't know that she'd reviewed the videos. That kind of information didn't get out to the rank and file. They knew that she got involved, and that then all of a sudden all these people were in trouble. And so that was a turning point for them. She got all these folks, in trouble, and that was the beginning and end of it. And then, of course, the deputy chief who became acting knew a lot more. He knew what happened. He knew what the investigation was, but it was his best friend. It created issues for him and going forward. And
I'm sure it did. Because our relationships in the fire service, they get into families, the families socialize together, the kids socialize together, and it makes it adds a layer of complexity that I don't think most people understand.
Yeah. And at that point in time, there needed to be really strong leadership in terms of how we're going to deal with the aftermath of this for the department as a whole, and for Chief Hendry as who became the target. And there was a void, there was the absence of that and the opposite of that in terms of leadership. So my 2 cents.
Okay. All right. So now we're at the point where things can't, it's just not the status quo. The status quo can't remain.
Yeah. So I went to HR and talked about what was happening. And this was no surprise to them. I had said in the beginning, I worked closely with many aspects of HR with just my duties as the administrative division chief. And we had actually actively talked about some of these things, like the concern around me being in the position of recruiting or having the task of trying to hire more women, which is a challenge for everybody in the fire service. Like, that's not an easy task. And then also with this happening. And so when I went to them, I was certain at the time that once I said that, yes, this is happening, and yes, I'm now to the point where, yes, I do want to file an internal complaint, that would be the end of it. That, they would get involved, step in, we would, dial up here, dial down there, and we would move forward. And that didn't happen. And so then there was, they hired an investigator to look into it. And
outside person?
Yes.
And it was,
excuse me, was it like an outside attorney, or was it?
Yes, it's a firm. Some firms, some of their attorneys do investigations, and it was one of those.
Yeah, one of the concerns, and this comes up a lot in my discipline class, is going to the outside. And unfortunately, sometimes when you go to the outside, the law firm gets direction. And instead of doing like a full and fair investigation, the type that we want to see in fire departments, but they're getting direction. So they have an end game when they go in. And I'm not saying that's what happened here, but I see it a lot. They have an end game, and now they're just going to construct the narrative to fill in the blanks to get to the goal that they want to get to.
That is what happened here. And it doesn't always happen that way, but in, doing this kind of law for all these years, and there's very often an outside investigator, and, and it's always an attorney. And I'll tell you that some firms have a reputation for doing a straight up impartial investigation, and some don't. And so when I learn who it is who's going to be involved, that may tell me something from the beginning. But we get to find out in litigation, you get to actually test the merits of the actually investigative process, because of course the employer has a duty to investigate. And so we get to test whether or not they met that duty, particularly when they come up with an investigation, a conclusion that, oh no, nothing substantiated. So we did that as part of this litigation. And, she didn't consider certain compelling evidence by cohorts, by fellow division chiefs who had information about what was happening to Chief Hendry. The stuff that didn't fit into the narrative, she didn't consider it. And she came to the conclusion she came to.
Did she have an explanation for why she didn't consider that evidence?
Typically, no. That when you're at, and then investigators, in deposition are asked that, there's, you didn't consider this. No, why not? Of course, we always ask that. Well, I don't know. I mean, what happens is there is no justification that they can offer, because there isn't, in fact, any justification.
That's interesting. I just covered a case about a year ago, but in Massachusetts, where Massachusetts has a statewide civil service system, but very similar situation, involved both male and female firefighters, but it was an allegation of sexual harassment. But they had an outside attorney come in, and the Mass Civil Service Commission, who all of the commissioners are attorneys, and they do the investigations, they ripped the investigation apart. I mean, if I was the attorney and I read the civil, I would want to crawl under a rock.
Yeah.
It was they lambasted this attorney and said it was a biased investigation from start to finish, simply to build a case to reach the end. It was really stunning in its bluntness.
Yeah, and we see that. And the other issue about the outside investigator is that if they want repeat business, so, City of Fremont is a public entity. If they want to have repeat business from other public entities, and that is any significant part of their business, well, then unfortunately, they're incentivized to have a finding that the public entity is going to like. And it's only if you as a public entity go in and say, look, whatever the answer is what it is. We want to know what really happened here. And, then I think, you get an investigate, and you get a real investigation.
The term I use is circling the wagons. And when the investigator takes the position that their job is part of circling the wagons to protect the client, then you know where it's going. It's not a full and fair and objective investigation. So
Diane was subjected to one of those.
Okay. So at the end of that, that's what prompted the suit, or?
Yeah, because at that point, then it had escalated quite a bit, and then I think emboldened and empowered the new chief and that deputy chief to feel vindicated, and that they were good to go. Like nothing that their treatment of me wasn't wrong. And so then it escalated to it was quite untenable.
Untenable.
Yeah.
But
it gets like that on the third floor sometimes in the fire.
But like, up here. Coming up through the ranks in the fire service, there's part of that we are used to, or you do endure. But I knew that I was squeezed, and so it was clear to me that I needed to draw the line in the sand with taking legal action. Because, I didn't feel I was going to survive the union's escalation, and then, the environment, in fire administration. And I really was not, I didn't have much of a job left.
Mhm.
I was pretty stripped of my duties and things that, I usually would have been working on or included in.
Mhm.
And so then I filed the lawsuit, and then it went to a whole nother level. It went to a whole nother level that I didn't foresee. And one of the things, Curt, you were saying about the fire service, and you both talked about the investigator and how cities can hire people to, like you said, circle the wagons. For me, the whole way through, as a long-term employee for the city of Fremont and having come up through the ranks, I was, heavily involved in the union for most of my time in suppression, treasurer, secretary, board member, negotiated contracts, had a lot of, I helped a lot of people promote to engineer, captain, was just very active in the department. That I didn't foresee that when I said something was happening to me, that would be the approach that was taken.
Yeah.
So as the employee, that did surprise me, that my coming forward and saying, hey, I'm being retaliated against for my involvement in this investigation. I never thought that would lead to where it did. I thought that would have been because of my tenure, my work history, my reputation, my performance, that I would have been believed and it would have been taken seriously.
As a division chief, were you in the bargaining unit or out of the bargaining unit?
I was out of the bargaining unit. I was still in a bargaining unit, but I was in the Fremont Association of Managers.
I got you. Okay. Deborah, you're going into court now. What's the legal theories going in?
Pure retaliation.
Okay.
Under the Fair Employment Housing Act, you may know, is very favorable. State law is probably the best out there. And we had one cause of action: retaliation.
Retaliation and the what was the triggering act would be, what would be the triggering act?
Well, it started out at the time we filed, and that she was being retaliated for her involvement in standing up for this recruit.
Okay.
And she was also by that point being retaliated against for filing an internal complaint for reporting the retaliation she was experiencing.
Is that retaliation on top of retaliation?
Well, and it kept going, right? It kept going because once the lawsuit was filed, she was retaliated against also for having had the temerity to file a lawsuit, right, against them. So there were layers. It was all retaliation, and there were actually many protected activities, starting from standing up for the recruit, going all the way through to filing the lawsuit. And then as she was subjected to more and egregious retaliation over the years, she dutifully reported it, and that led to essentially more retaliation. Yeah.
So I guess one of the next, like key points in all of it was, it had gotten quite difficult for me after I filed the lawsuit. And so the police chief at the time, she and I had come up through the ranks around the same time. So I was on the fire side and she'd come up through the ranks on the police side. And so she was now the police chief. And so we would connect and talk. And so she knew what I was experiencing, and that it was it was because of what had happened to this recruit. And so at some point she said, Diane, why don't you come over to the police department while all of this gets worked out? She's like, there's so much work that we have. We could, use all of your skills, and you could just come over here and help us with some projects and programs while this gets settled out. And so I reached out to Deb and had said that she made that offer. And then at some point the city agreed, and I transferred to the police department. And so that like 2018?
It was the end of 2018. It was a written agreement that she would transfer, would be temporary, that it wouldn't be interpreted as, we wouldn't interpret it as retaliation for them agreeing to move her, but it was a win-win. This has happened in other cases where, you know, the city needs to figure out what they're going to do about it, but in the meantime, they're taking her out of harm's way, and it's something she's agreed to. So this was all spelled out in agreement, and it was a good, it should have been a really great solution. It was a good solution as far as it went, but they reacted to it very badly. They, as in the fire department, the fire service.
Yeah,
force.
so
Yeah.
then I transferred over, and then the chief and the deputy chief turned off all my access. Email, buildings, my key card didn't work. I was completely removed. So this temporary transfer then led to, I had less access to the fire department than a retired employee or a private citizen on the street. And so I had gone over to the fire department to help police with one of my roles too is I was the PIO for the fire department. So I was helping the police PIO with setting up for a media interview, and my key card didn't work. I couldn't get into the fire admin building. And that was the first tell that something had happened. And so then when I went and looked into it all, like I had been completely removed. And so I had told the police chief, told Deb, and then that was the first point where the police chief was like, okay, this is too much. Like, you know, she went to the city manager and the fire chief and said, this is retaliation and you are treating her differently. And she's a full-time employee here, and I need her to be able to function as one. And so we worked through getting some of that back, but that was one of the real obvious points of, you know, the feelings that the chief and the deputy chief had at the time.
And that didn't trigger something with the city manager. That
Yeah.
little exchange right there he would have put them back on their heels and say, wait a minute.
Yeah, so that's where it gets complicated in terms of there was a failure of leadership in city management for a number of reasons that I'll get to in a minute. But it is that this was so telling that this happened immediately after she was transferred over. And that was just the harbinger of what was to come. So they couldn't let go of it. She was not, you know, there. She was continuing in being a great employee for the city, but out of their hair, so to speak. And they could not let go of what she had reported and her involvement. But at this time, the city manager was basically absent. He ultimately is somebody who had to resign, and he's under indictment. And this assistant city manager moved into, essentially was filling in for him, and he was extremely problematic. They, you know, along with the outside counsel and the director of HR at the time, just dug in their heels. They didn't act, you know, they did nothing. And at best, they did nothing. And by doing nothing, it just, it did embolden and fueled what was to come in the following years.
Only because this is how my brain works. Was the municipal insurance company involved, or are they self-employed? Self-employed.
They have pool insurance, and I always wonder, as plaintiff's counsel, what reports they're getting.
Yeah,
because and I can tell you that the defense counsel that we dealt with is one of the worst we've ever dealt with. Well, I've ever dealt with in my 30-some year career. It became clear that he himself was, and I don't know how much he knew about the day-to-day, but he had his own narrative about this case. And I don't know what he was reporting to the powers that be in the city, or, you know, to the carrier. But we realized early on, my partner and I really realized early on that the only way we were going to get anywhere in this case is if we could get past him.
Litigation, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm taking the other side in this, but I do know that many times when we get to the point of litigation, that the plaintiff in the case is not everything that it appears, that the plaintiff has a number of problems. And I wonder if defense counsel had convinced himself or herself, whoever, but had convinced himself that she was the problem, that Diane was the problem, and that his job was to try to cut the tumor out of the patient without really critically analyzing what was going on.
He had to not only fail to critically analyze, he had to ignore everything that everyone was telling him or would have been telling him. There's literally no one in the city who would have said could ever say anything negative about her and her involvement. And that's ultimately why they ultimately resolved. But no, he wasn't looking at this by looking at what the evidence, he had a narrative. And I mean, I have talked to other, counsel, plaintiff's counsel, and I've, learned a fair amount about him over the years of dealing with him. And, it's his MO to some extent. And so so unfortunately, in this case, there was not only a failure of leadership in the city, at the highest levels for various reasons. There was also a defense counsel who didn't do the city any favors in leading, because good defense counsels, from my perspective, can be incredibly valuable in educating their client and providing information and helping them navigate all of this. And he didn't do that.
Yeah, and I think, again, because I've done some work with municipal insurance trusts, so I know how they tend to oversee. They don't want to get involved in the strategy too much, but you would think that they would also want to say, why is this going on? Why aren't we getting anywhere with this?
Yeah,
because ultimately they're paying the bill.
Exactly. That we wondered that for years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was to your point of where you started with that, is the fire chief at the time, the fire chief from San Jose who came to Fremont. We learned through deposition and from his own words that he adamantly did not want me back, and that he had expressed that throughout city leadership, that I was not coming back. And he based that off of he had been sued by two women in San Jose, two women who had taken the battalion chief's test, and that he had said that from his experience, it just doesn't go well when somebody has sued the department if you bring them back.
That's what he said in deposition.
Well, that brings us to the settlement. Because you would think that they would have coached them a little bit, even if that's what was inside of them. I think a good attorney is going to sit down with a key witness and kind of review the kinds of questions you're going to get and say, oh, don't say that. But so. Yeah.
That happened long before settlement. I mean, that was one example. And it was an example we usually put, first when we're writing things up, but it was by no means, there was a lot of examples like that. And we just were trying to get this in front of someone who would do something about it. Mm-hmm. And that was that ended up being the challenge. Yeah. I mean, one of the many challenges. Yeah. And in getting it resolved and having this go anywhere. Wow. Yeah.
So let's talk about the settlement, because we haven't mentioned the amount, but let's
So we were hard charging to trial, like our first court date was gonna be before Thanksgiving, and we had mediated twice before.
Mhm.
The first time was with a retired judge who was tasked with early on. So I was already at PD, but we got to the point where we were going to mediate, and he was going to evaluate, look into what happened, and make recommendations. And
Mhm.
so I was still like, I'm glass half full. So I was hopeful that this was going to do the trick and we were going to, move forward. And so we recommended that they hire back the retired city manager.
Yeah, and just to be clear, just so that it doesn't, so there's no mediation privilege she's revealing. It kind of sounds like it. But if you don't mind me just
Sure, no, go ahead.
circuiting this, because it was a very unusual situation. Mediations, you usually go in, everybody knows there's a mediation, but nobody knows what happens at that mediation.
Right.
And we went into this because the whole point of the lawsuit, from Chief Hendry's perspective and ours as well, is we want this to change, right? This is not about the money. This is about, there's a huge problem here. And it's done a disservice to Chief Hendry and all these other women in the fire service. And so,
And I just wanted my career back on track.
yes,
That's all I wanted.
Right.
I wanted to pick up from where I left off, and that I wasn't going to be
Right.
completely derailed.
And so since that was the goal, getting the career back on track, it came up, in the media, it came up that one way to do that was if the parties agreed to a process whereby agreed upon neutrals would evaluate the state of the state, what's happening at Fremont. And because we need to fix it, that would probably include training and education. And so there was an agreement that came out of this that was ultimately reduced to writing, and some of it is a matter of public record in court documents. So that's why that's the part we're focusing on. But the agreement was this retired justice. He's a retired appellate court justice who was mediating. And the city agreed that he would do it, and that they would the city manager who had been recently retired, who knew about what was happening but left before everything fell apart, that the city could have him come in as a consultant, and the two of them would conduct this evaluation. And they did it over a period of months, and again, this part is part of the public record, that they interviewed lots of people, a lot of stakeholders, and they ultimately issued a report and recommendations, privately, confidentially. But the idea is after they went through that several month process, that the parties would reconvene and regroup and see where we went from there. And that was the understanding. And at the end of that process, a report and recommendations was issued, but the city did not want to regroup. And they basically took the position that the report and that the mediator and the retired city manager had gone out of scope, outside of the scope, and they wanted nothing to do with it. And so it was as if they acted as if it never happened. And we moved on and continued in litigation. So that was that first process. There was a second failed mediation, and then
This was that mandatory, what's it called? A mandatory case settlement?
So where it settled was as part of the mandatory settlement conference that happens when you're getting close to trial.
Yeah. I mean, we have I don't know if it's used in California, but we call it here grinding the other side, that you're literally grinding, you're trying to wear down the other side, increase their costs, and get them to the point where they're willing to, it sounds like it's just they're trying to grind you.
Absolutely. And which was ironic because, well, two things. We don't nobody has successfully done that with us. I mean, that just makes me mad, right? That I just dig in. Ask my mother, right? I'm very stubborn. It's like I will spend, and because we front all costs, right? We're not getting paid, but California the statute has an attorney's fees provision.
Mhm.
And this is righteous and
Mhm.
something needs to be done. And
Mhm.
so no, I don't, they actually had got a discovery referee involved on that we had to pay for by the hour in order for us to get things resolved that we needed to get resolved in order to get the evidence.
They were fighting you on discovery requests.
Oh my gosh. And
That's
then
grinding. We call it
wait,
grinding. They grind. One side is
they
grinding.
insisted that we have to hire a discovery referee, and the courts overworked. So of course they said, yes, please get a discovery referee. And so the grinding part was on top of everything else, we were paying for that. But yes, that's what they were doing. And that's so sad because of course it is the taxpayers who are ultimately paying us at the end of the day. We don't want that money from we don't want to be paid that way. That shouldn't happen. We don't, the grinding is, yes, we had to spend all this time. She had to go through all of this, but this could have been resolved, so long ago and not at the cost it was they ultimately had to pay if they hadn't ground us for all that time. But believe me, since they did grind us, they needed to pay. They needed to pay for the attorney's fees and the costs, and also because they successfully derailed Chief Henry's career.
Yeah.
So they had to pay for that.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it was 2.6 million. Am I right? Yeah.
2.6
million. And on top of that, they agreed to pay, they don't want her there. And so, but she has to be allowed to get through to what her retirement is. So she's on paid administrative leave at what her salary was through September of this year, when she would have, been eligible to retire. So that is not a result that any of us wanted. If they had done what they needed to do, get her career back on track, this could have been resolved in the first month after she filed.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, it was a long vlog, longer than we usually try to hit for like 20 to 30 minutes, but I really think it was a worthwhile discussion. I really do. And I know there's other women out there, not a lot of, division chiefs out there, but I think there's a lot of women out there that are struggling with the situation that they find themselves in. And I don't know if you have any words of wisdom for the folks that may be listening, and in terms of what lessons you've learned along the way. And
the difficulties and the challenges of the job definitely change when you come out of suppression, from probably most places, probably battalion chief up. So like those, as hard as the job was, physically, emotionally taxing in the station, it completely changed, the obstacles and the landmines, and, they drastically change in the administrative role. But I think the words of wisdom are, we are not going to make the amount of change that we need to make if we don't speak up and tell our stories. I can look back on my career, and if I could tell my younger self, I would tell my younger self to, you don't have to go along with as much as you've gone along with, and to build amazing relationships with the women around you, because I spent so much time trying to fit in and do a good job and get along and establish my right to be here, which I think I did. But what I can look back and see is that my hope of doing that was to show that there's a place for us. There's a place for women in the fire service, and we're actually needed. Like it's a good thing. It's a great thing. And that through my work history and my performance and my personality, that I would have established that. But in the end, I should have spent more time helping more women and bringing more women along, because when this all got difficult for me, it was the amazing women that were there for me.
Well, that's my next question is, did you have a network of support? Like with only 2 women in the department, I'm sure there was some men that had, some support for you, but did you have a network? And let me just couch this. You kind of think about what you're going to say, but I went from a line captain's position as lieutenant captain. I went into headquarters as a safety officer, as a battalion chief, and I wasn't ready for how alone I would feel at headquarters. And I had the other chiefs. I was quite a bit younger than any of the other chiefs, but there was an aloneness that I think goes with going to headquarters, that I wasn't ready for, and I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. In fact, I got back on a shift as soon as I could. Okay, but I think you were dealing with probably some of that aloneness, and then the position you were in, you had all of the lousy assignments. You weren't chief of ops, which is probably one of the better of the headquarters spots. But you had all the lousy assignments, and now you're by yourself. And I found it very, very difficult as a man in man's world in our fire department at the time.
Yeah, and then I was the highest ranking woman ever at the time in the department. So there is that. I think as women, we probably adjust to that a little bit better, because it's not an unfamiliar feeling being in the fire service. There's many a times that you feel alone or the only, but there was that transition. And then just really the shock of when I did stand up for myself, just how it's like, whoa, like hands off now, so that people who had been there for me, it got even less, right? Like all of a sudden it's like, oh, like we talked about, like I took things too far. But the amazing thing along the way was all of these amazing women that, supported me and helped me along the way. And it might not have been like a long-term thing, or it could have, sometimes it was just one thing along, while I was going through this, where what they did either significantly impacted me in a positive way, or what they did significantly impacted the outcome of my case. So one of those being like the police chief letting me come to the police department. Another along the way was one of the HR managers that had gone to a different city. She had left Fremont and gone someplace else, and that she had come, she super supported me and came forward with a lot of evidence and support, which she didn't have to do. There was just, I mean, I'm not surprised. I was more surprised at how few of the men that I had built, decade-long relationships with were not. But it did show me that, in the fire service, we focus a lot on, or I can look back and think we focused a lot on the men, and like how to bring more women in, and what do we need to do? How do we change the culture? And, how do we get more men to support women? And I can look back now and see we should focus more on the women and building the relationships with women, because if there were more women in the fire department and we did increase the percentage and the numbers, then that would just work itself out just because of numbers.
Yeah.
That, so I'm involved with NorCal Women in the Fire Service. I'm one of the founding members. And one of our big initiatives that we do is we put on girls' camps, fire camps for girls in high school. And we've been doing it about 3 or 4 years now. We have our next camp coming up in Santa Clara County. But really putting the energy into, showing the fire service and what a great career it is to, you know, women and girls at a younger age, and focusing less on, you know, how to get, you know, how to change the men, or to change, you know, to get them to do it for us.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both for spending the time and getting this documented. And I look forward to you know, some feedback from folks that are listening. And I really appreciate the opportunity to first of all get to meet you. We've never met in person, and you know, to hear your story. Okay.
Well, thank you, Curt. Like I said at the beginning, thank you for doing this for the fire service and highlighting the cases. And, you know, one of the last things for me is that I think we're sometimes so scared in the fire service to make mistakes, or departments are scared that they have something like this happen. Like we had this happen in Fremont, like nobody foresaw that we were going to wrongfully terminate a woman from the academy, and that then this would happen to me. But that we need to talk about these things. Like, the only way we fix it and get better is to highlight these things and talk about them, and not from a point where we're pointing fingers at one department or another department, or this department screwed up or that one is. But it's if we don't ever get to the place where we talk about these things and we come up with actual actionable items to fix it and move forward, that it doesn't always have to be this cover up where we're afraid to expose ourselves. I don't think we're going to move forward as fast as we could be. So thank you for doing this.
No, I echo that also. I know I was on the phone yesterday with a firefighter who's got some legal issues, and my career goes back to 1972. Now I'm going to date myself. But I started in the fire service in 1972. And in 1972, we didn't investigate line of duty deaths, and we didn't critique fires. And it was not considered appropriate to discuss what happened at a fire if you weren't there. And as a result, we kept killing firefighters and killing firefighters and killing firefighters. Every news article about a fire had the obligatory body count of 15 firefighters smoke inhalation, 10 firefighters smoke inhalation. It was standard. And I know that probably seems like craziness today, because we don't see it. But finally, and I think Alan Brunacini was really one of the key people who said, enough is enough. We've got to start investigating what's leading to firefighters getting killed, what's leading to firefighters getting hurt. The heck with hurting people's feelings, that we've got to analyze this. And I think from my perspective, I want to do the same thing with litigation, that we've got to look at what's leading to these discrimination claims, what's leading to sexual harassment claims, and how do we resolve them? How do we prevent it from happening again? We want to prevent a line of duty death. We want to prevent a Mayday from happening. We want to prevent these sort of administrative Maydays and people prematurely ending their careers, crashing their careers. But we've got to be willing to have that honest discussion about it. And there's going to be people that listen to this and they're not going to like what you had to say. Okay, so I say lump it, but
I say something similar, only a different word.
All right, well, on that note, we will bid adieu, and
Okay.
hopefully we'll see you again sometime. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you both.
thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Okay.